He survived 100 battles, a dozen assassination plots, and the combined military might of two Roman empires that spent decades trying and failing to kill him. Then, on the single happiest night of his life, at his own wedding feast, something as ordinary as a nosebleed finished what every enemy army in Europe couldn't. No blade touched him. No poison has ever been proven. Just too much wine, one bad sleeping position, and a body that simply stopped working before morning. The man they called the Scourge of God died the same way anyone could, quietly, in bed, and completely alone in the dark. By the middle of the 5th century AD, there was arguably no single individual on the European continent whose name provoked more immediate, visceral fear than Attila, ruler of the Hunnic Empire, a vast, loosely bound confederation of steppe peoples whose territory, at its height, stretched from the Central Asian grasslands westward across the Great Hungarian Plain and into the borderlands of both halves of the divided Roman world. To call the Huns simply another Germanic or steppe tribal confederation understates just how genuinely unprecedented the scale of political and military organization Attila had managed to impose upon this sprawling, ethnically diverse territory actually was, and it understates just how thoroughly his personal reputation had come to shape Roman strategic thinking throughout both the eastern and western halves of an empire that, by this point in its history, could agree on very little else. The nickname history remembers him by, the Scourge of God, flagellum Dei in the Latin the Romans themselves used, did not originate as a term of grudging military respect in the way modern audiences sometimes assume. It reflected something closer to genuine theological terror. Roman writers of the period, operating within a deeply Christian intellectual framework that understood historical catastrophe as divine punishment for collective sin, increasingly came to interpret Attila's campaigns not simply as the actions of a powerful foreign king, but as an instrument of God's own displeasure, a punishment visited upon a Christian empire that had, in this reading, failed to live up to its own professed moral standards. Attila was not just an enemy to be defeated. He was, in the imagination of many contemporary Roman Christians, something closer to a plague or a divine judgment given human form. This theological framing existed alongside, and was reinforced by, the very concrete and practical military reality of what Attila's forces were capable of achieving. The Hunnic army's core strength lay in mounted horse archery of a sophistication and tactical flexibility that Roman infantry-based military doctrine, despite centuries of accumulated institutional experience fighting various steppe and Germanic opponents, had never fully developed an effective counter for. Hunnic riders could strike, inflict devastating casualties through sustained ranged fire delivered from horseback, and withdraw before conventional Roman formations could bring their own tactical advantages to bear. The same fundamental mobility-based warfare that mounted steppe peoples had employed against settled civilizations for centuries before Attila's rise, but organized and directed under his specific leadership, with a level of strategic coordination across an unusually vast and diverse confederation of subject and allied peoples that few, if any, previous steppe leaders had managed to achieve or sustain. The Eastern Roman Empire, ruling from Constantinople, had learned through bitter and repeated experience that direct military confrontation with Attila's forces carried unacceptable risk, and had instead settled into a pattern of paying substantial annual tribute, vast quantities of gold, delivered on a regular schedule, specifically to purchase Attila's continued forbearance from launching further devastating campaigns into Eastern Roman territory. This arrangement, humiliating as it was for an empire that had, in earlier centuries, considered itself the unquestioned dominant power of the entire Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, reflected a coldly pragmatic calculation. The cost of sustained tribute payments, however substantial, remained considerably lower than the cost of the destruction Attila's campaigns had already demonstrated he was capable of inflicting when that tribute was withheld, or when he simply judged renewed warfare more profitable than continued peace. What makes Attila's historical reputation particularly fascinating to later historians, and what distinguishes the surviving record of his life from that of many other steppe conquerors whose personal characters remain frustratingly obscure behind the destruction their campaigns left in the historical and archaeological record, is the survival of a genuinely detailed, first-hand eyewitness account of Attila's court and personal habits, preserved through the writings of Priscus of Panium, a Roman diplomat who travelled to Attila's camp as part of an official Eastern Roman embassy in 449 AD, and recorded his observations with the kind of careful, specific attention that makes his account one of the most valuable ethnographic and biographical sources to survive from this entire period of late antique history. Priscus's account presents a portrait of Attila that diverges sharply from the image of unrestrained barbarian excess that popular imagination, both in his own era and in subsequent centuries, tended to associate with steppe conquerors of his reputation and destructive capability. Priscus specifically records that at a lavish banquet hosted by Attila for the visiting Roman delegation, at which other guests were served on ornate silver plates and drank from precious vessels befitting the occasion's evident wealth and grandeur, Attila himself ate simple food from a plain wooden plate and drank from an unadorned wooden cup, while wearing clothing notably unadorned by the jewelry, fine fabrics, or other ostentatious displays of wealth that his subordinate commanders and allied nobles wore freely around him. This deliberate personal austerity, Priscus suggests, was not poverty, but calculated self-presentation, a ruler whose actual power was so thoroughly established that he had no practical need to signal it through personal display, in pointed contrast to the aspiring nobles around him who still needed exactly that kind of visible wealth to assert and maintain their own comparatively more precarious status. By the early 450s, Attila had survived decades of continuous warfare, had extracted staggering quantities of tribute gold from an Eastern Roman government that had repeatedly proven unable to resist him militarily, and commanded the loyalty, whether through genuine allegiance or simple calculated fear, of a vast and ethnically diverse confederation of peoples stretching across a significant portion of the European continent. He had survived battlefield engagements, the ordinary hazards of decades spent almost constantly on campaign, and whatever undocumented assassination attempts a man of his position and the number of enemies he had accumulated across a lifetime of conquest must inevitably have faced. His power, by every conventional historical measure available for assessing the strength of a 5th-century ruler, appeared as secure and dominant as it had ever been. Nothing in the historical record suggests that anyone, including Attila himself, anticipated that his life was approaching its final chapter, and certainly no one could have predicted the specific, almost absurdly mundane manner in which that chapter would actually conclude. It is worth pausing here to consider just how thoroughly Attila's reputation had reshaped Roman strategic culture across an entire generation. Roman military and political thinking in this period had, for centuries, operated on the assumption that the empire, whatever its internal difficulties, retained fundamental strategic superiority over any individual foreign power it might face. Attila's career quietly and completely inverted that assumption for an entire generation of Roman statesmen, who found themselves organizing imperial policy not around how to defeat him, but around how to manage, delay, and survive him, a psychological and strategic adjustment that historians studying the broader collapse of Roman power in this period consistently identify as one of the clearest available symptoms of just how far Roman military and institutional capacity had already deteriorated by the middle of the 5th century, well before the Western Empire's final formal dissolution. The year before his death, 452 AD, had seen Attila lead a major military campaign into the Italian peninsula itself, striking directly at the heart of the Western Roman Empire's remaining territory in a campaign that produced genuine panic throughout Italy and reportedly caused the Western Roman Emperor, Valentinian III, to abandon his court and flee for personal safety rather than remain in a capital that suddenly appeared dangerously exposed to direct Hunnic assault. The campaign's most dramatic and historically consequential episode involved the northern Italian city of Aquileia, a wealthy and strategically significant urban centre that Attila's forces besieged and, after a prolonged and evidently difficult siege that tested even the Huns' considerable capacity for sustained military pressure, ultimately captured and destroyed so thoroughly that later generations, according to some historical accounts, struggled to precisely locate where the once flourishing city had actually stood. The scale of this destruction served, as such demonstrations frequently did throughout Attila's career, a calculated psychological purpose extending well beyond the immediate military value of eliminating Aquileia itself. A visible, unmistakable warning to every other Italian city watching from a cautious distance about the consequences of continued resistance. Despite this display of overwhelming military capability, Attila's Italian campaign ultimately concluded without an assault on Rome itself, a decision that has generated considerable historical debate and speculation regarding its actual underlying causes. The traditional account, preserved and elaborated within later Christian historical tradition, credits Pope Leo I with personally travelling to meet Attila and persuading him, through some combination of diplomatic skill and what Christian tradition would eventually present as divinely inspired intervention, to withdraw his forces from Italy rather than advancing on the city. This diplomatic meeting between Leo and Attila is well attested in the surviving historical sources and appears to represent a genuine historical event rather than later pious invention. Though modern historians generally treat the specific causal weight attributed to Leo's personal persuasive influence with somewhat more caution than the traditional pious account allows. Modern historical analysis of this episode typically emphasizes several additional, more practically grounded factors that likely contributed to Attila's decision, alongside whatever genuine impact Leo's diplomatic mission achieved. Attila's forces by this point in the campaign had reportedly been affected by disease spreading through the army's ranks, a genuinely common and historically well-documented hazard for any large pre-modern military force remaining concentrated in a single region for an extended campaign season, particularly one operating in unfamiliar territory with correspondingly unfamiliar disease exposure. Additionally, the campaign's supply situation had apparently grown increasingly difficult as the Hunnic army, dependent on the kind of continuous foraging and plunder that sustained campaigns of this nature required, found the specific resources of the Italian countryside increasingly strained by the sheer scale of the force it was attempting to sustain. Whatever the precise combination of diplomatic persuasion, disease, and logistical strain that actually produced Attila's withdrawal, the practical outcome was the same. Rome itself was spared direct assault, and Attila led his forces back north across the Alps to his customary base of operations in the region of the Danube River, in territory corresponding to modern Hungary. Rather than treating this withdrawal as any kind of meaningful setback or the natural conclusion of his ambitions, Attila almost immediately began directing his considerable political and military attention toward a renewed campaign against the Eastern Roman Empire, whose new emperor, Marcian, had recently taken the politically risky step of refusing to continue the substantial annual tribute payments that Attila's predecessors in Constantinople had reluctantly maintained for years as the price of continued peace. This refusal represented a direct and calculated challenge to Attila's authority and to the entire tribute-based system of extraction he had spent decades constructing and enforcing through the credible threat of devastating military consequence for non-payment. and by the early months of 453 AD, Attila was actively engaged in the logistical and diplomatic preparations necessary for a major renewed campaign specifically intended to punish Marcion's defiance and reassert the tribute arrangement Constantinople had, however temporarily, attempted to escape. It was in the midst of these serious, large-scale military preparations that Attila, then approximately 47 years old by the most commonly accepted historical estimates of his birth date, made a personal decision that seemed, at the time, entirely unremarkable within the broader context of his life and position. He decided to take an additional wife. Polygamy was an established and unremarkable practice within Hunnic royal custom, and Attila, by this point in his reign, already possessed numerous wives, representing various political alliances and personal relationships accumulated across decades of rule. A new marriage, however significant the specific occasion might prove for the individuals directly involved, represented nothing approaching a departure from established royal practice or any kind of unusual event within the broader sweep of Attila's reign. The specific woman selected for this new marriage was named Ildico, a young woman whom the surviving historical sources describe as notably beautiful, and whom most historians studying this period believe was likely of Ostrogothic or broader Germanic origin, meaning she came from one of the various peoples who existed as subject populations or allied groups within the broader, ethnically diverse Hunnic Imperial Confederation that Attila's authority extended over. Whatever the specific political calculations, personal attractions, or combination of both factors that led to this particular match, the wedding was scheduled to take place amid the ongoing military preparations for the renewed Eastern campaign, a celebration that would prove to be, though absolutely no one attending could have possibly anticipated it at the time, the final major event of Attila's long and consequential life. The broader political context surrounding this marriage deserves a moment of additional attention, since it illustrates just how thoroughly Attila's personal and political life had, by this stage of his reign, become inseparable from the larger machinery of confederation management he had spent decades building and maintaining. Marriages within the Hunnic royal household were rarely, if ever, purely personal matters divorced from calculated political consequence. Each new union carried the potential to strengthen ties with a particular subject people, reward a loyal ally, or simply reinforce, through the accumulation of an ever larger royal household, the visible scale of Attila's dynastic authority relative to every other claimant to power within his sprawling confederation. Whether the marriage to Ildico specifically served one of these calculated political functions, reflected genuine personal preference on Attila's part, or some combination of both motivations, the wedding itself was, by every measure available in the surviving sources, treated by the assembled court as an event of first-order political significance, deserving the full scale of ceremonial investment that the following episode will describe in detail. The wedding celebration that Attila's court organized for his marriage to Ildico in early 453 AD reflected the full scale of resources and organizational capacity that decades of successful conquest, systematic tribute extraction, and calculated alliance building had placed at the Hunnic ruler's disposal. This was not a modest or private family occasion, but a major political and diplomatic event in its own right, drawing an assembly of military commanders, subject kings, and diplomatic representatives from across the vast and ethnically varied territory that Attila's authority extended over, along with representatives from the various foreign powers, including Rome itself, that maintained ongoing diplomatic relations with the Hunnic court, regardless of the frequently tense and adversarial character those relations typically carried. Attila's court, though built around the essentially mobile, tent-based living arrangements, characteristic of steppe nomadic tradition, rather than the fixed palace architecture that settled Mediterranean civilizations relied upon for comparable displays of royal grandeur, had nonetheless developed an extraordinarily lavish material culture over decades of successful conquest and tribute extraction. The wedding celebration's central hall, according to the surviving descriptions drawing on accounts like those preserved through Priscus's earlier first-hand observations of Hunnic court life, was decorated with fine carpets, elaborate textiles, and precious fabrics, much of it originally looted or extracted as tribute from Roman and Persian territories, transforming the interior of what remained, structurally, a large wooden and felt tent complex into a space of genuine opulence that visiting foreign dignitaries reportedly found genuinely impressive despite whatever cultural preconceptions about steppe nomadic barbarism they may have carried into the experience. The celebration itself extended across multiple days and incorporated the full range of entertainments and displays appropriate to an event of this political significance. Demonstrations of horsemanship and archery skill from among the Hunnic military's most accomplished warriors, providing both genuine entertainment and an implicit, unmissable reminder to the assembled foreign dignitaries of exactly what kind of military capability their host commanded. Elaborate feasting continued throughout the celebration, with substantial quantities of meat and other provisions made available to the assembled guests, in a display of abundance calculated to reinforce impressions of Hunnic wealth and power to every observer present, domestic and foreign alike. What flowed most abundantly throughout the celebration, however, and what would ultimately prove most historically consequential regarding the events that followed, was wine and other alcoholic beverages, consumed in the kind of genuinely substantial quantities that steppe nomadic cultural tradition frequently associated with appropriate celebration of major occasions, a cultural pattern well documented across numerous nomadic and semi-nomadic societies throughout history, in which sustained, heavy drinking during major communal celebrations functioned as an expected and even socially mandatory expression of celebratory abundance and communal bonding, rather than representing any kind of individual moral failing or unusual personal indulgence on the part of specific participants. This particular detail regarding sustained heavy drinking as an established feature of major Hunnic celebrations deserves emphasis, because it stands in genuinely notable contrast to what the surviving historical record otherwise tells us about Attila's typical, everyday personal habits regarding alcohol consumption, a contrast that becomes directly relevant to understanding exactly what happened in the specific hours following this particular celebration's conclusion, and that the following episode will examine in considerably greater detail. The diplomatic and political significance of this gathering extended well beyond the immediate personal celebration of Attila's marriage itself. For the assembled subject kings, allied commanders, and foreign diplomatic representatives, the wedding functioned as an opportunity for the kind of face-to-face political interaction, alliance reinforcement, and status negotiation that major court gatherings throughout history have consistently facilitated, providing a concentrated window of opportunity for exactly the kind of personal relationship building and political maneuvering that the more routine, geographically dispersed administration of Attila's vast confederation rarely allowed for on this scale. Every prominent figure within the Hunnic political and military hierarchy, along with representatives from every significant foreign power maintaining relations with Attila's court, had reason to be present, to be seen participating appropriately in the celebration, and to use the occasion for whatever specific diplomatic or personal objectives their own position within this complex political landscape required. None of the assembled guests, participating in what was, by every available account, an entirely conventional and expected celebration of a powerful ruler's latest marriage, could have possessed any reason to suspect that this particular gathering would prove to be the final major public event of Attila's reign, or that the ruler whose military campaigns had terrorized two Roman empires for decades would, within the space of a single night following this celebration's conclusion, be dead. not through any of the countless forms of violent death that a man in his position might reasonably have anticipated as an occupational hazard of sustained conquest and rule, but through a sequence of ordinary physiological events that could, in principle, have befallen any heavy drinker anywhere in the ancient or modern world. To fully appreciate the genuine historical significance of what happened on the night following Attila's wedding celebration, it is necessary to understand just how thoroughly this particular evening's conduct actually diverged from the ruler's well-documented, typical personal habits regarding food and drink, a divergence that Priscus's earlier first-hand diplomatic account makes unusually clear, and that transforms what might otherwise read as a simple, unremarkable story of heavy drinking at a celebration into something considerably more specific and historically interesting. Priscus's detailed account of his 449 AD diplomatic mission to Attila's court, written several years before the wedding, and the events that would follow it, specifically and repeatedly emphasizes Attila's personal restraint and discipline regarding food, drink, and material display, in pointed and evidently deliberate contrast to the behavior of the various subordinate commanders, allied nobles, and court officials who surrounded him. At the specific banquet Priscus personally witnessed and described in detail, he records that while other guests ate from elaborate silver plates and consumed the abundant wine and food made available with evident and largely unrestrained enthusiasm, Attila himself ate sparingly from a simple wooden plate and drank in visibly moderate quantities, maintaining throughout the entire lengthy celebration a level of personal composure and self-control that Priscus, an experienced Roman diplomat, accustomed to observing and evaluating foreign rulers across numerous different courts and cultural contexts, evidently found notable enough to specifically record for his own contemporary Roman readership. This pattern of personal restraint, consistently documented across multiple observed occasions and evidently well established as characteristic of Attila's general conduct throughout his adult life and reign, makes his conduct at his own wedding celebration in 453 AD genuinely exceptional and historically significant, rather than representing simply one more unremarkable instance of a habitually heavy drinker overindulging on a particular occasion. Historical accounts of the wedding celebration specifically note that Attila, on this particular night, departed dramatically and uncharacteristically from his usual pattern of moderation, consuming wine in substantial quantities throughout an extended celebration that continued for many hours, personally participating in the kind of sustained toasting and ceremonial drinking with the assembled guests, commanders and dignitaries that Hunnic celebratory custom evidently expected and required of a ruler marking such a significant personal and political occasion. Several factors likely combined to produce this notable departure from Attila's typical personal restraint, though the surviving historical sources do not provide sufficiently detailed psychological insight to establish with certainty the precise weighting of these various contributing factors. The genuine personal significance of the occasion itself, a new marriage, however many wives Attila already possessed, nonetheless representing a moment of personal celebration within an otherwise relentlessly demanding life, consumed by decades of continuous military campaigning and political administration, likely provided genuine emotional motivation for uncharacteristic indulgence. The cultural and social expectations surrounding a major royal wedding celebration, requiring the host to personally participate in extended rounds of ceremonial toasting with the numerous important guests and subordinate commanders who had traveled considerable distances specifically to honor the occasion with their presence, created social pressure towards sustained drinking that a more routine, private occasion would not have generated. And the general atmosphere of confident celebration surrounding a ruler whose military and political position appeared, by every available measure, more secure and dominant than it had ever previously been, likely contributed to a psychological environment in which uncharacteristic indulgence felt, in the moment, entirely safe and appropriate, rather than representing any kind of meaningful personal risk. The physiological consequences of this uncharacteristic pattern of sustained heavy alcohol consumption, for a body evidently not well accustomed to processing quantities of this scale on a regular basis, would have been genuinely significant regardless of Attila's specific age, general physical condition, or any other individual health factors that might have influenced his particular vulnerability to the specific sequence of events that followed. Substantial alcohol consumption produces well-documented physiological effects extending across multiple bodily systems. Significant vasodilation, in which blood vessels throughout the body, including those in the nasal passages, expand and become measurably more fragile and prone to rupture. Elevated blood pressure, at least in the initial phases of intoxication, before the depressant effects of alcohol begin producing the opposite effect. And, critically for understanding what followed, a substantial suppression of the normal reflexive responses, coughing, gagging, the automatic physical repositioning that occurs even during ordinary sleep, that a sober or only mildly intoxicated body relies upon to protect the airway from exactly the kind of obstruction that was about to occur. By the time the wedding celebration finally concluded and Attila withdrew, in the company of his new bride Ildico, to the private chambers where the marriage would be formally consummated, according to established custom, he was, according to the consistent weight of the surviving historical accounts, in a state of significant intoxication, considerably beyond anything his typical, carefully documented pattern of personal restraint would ordinarily have permitted. A state that, combined with the specific physical position he apparently assumed once he finally lay down to sleep, would prove within a matter of hours to be fatal. What actually transpired within the private nuptial chamber where Attila and his new bride Ildico retired, following the conclusion of the wedding celebration, remains, in its full specific detail, permanently unknowable to history. No eyewitness account of the chamber's interior during the specific hours that followed survives, and the surviving historical sources, working from second-hand and reconstructed information gathered in the immediate aftermath of the events, provide only the broad outline of what apparently occurred, rather than a detailed, moment-by-moment account. What the surviving sources do establish with reasonable historical confidence, based on the physical evidence discovered the following morning and the broader medical logic that both ancient and modern observers have applied to reconstructing the sequence of events, is that Attila, having consumed wine in the substantial and uncharacteristic quantities described in the previous episode, eventually lay down to sleep in a position that modern medical understanding recognizes as carrying genuinely significant risk for anyone in a state of substantial intoxication, lying flat on his back rather than on his side or in some other position that would have allowed gravity to assist in clearing any obstruction from his airway. At some point during the night, Attila experienced what the surviving historical accounts describe as a severe nosebleed, a spontaneous rupture of blood vessels within the nasal passages, a phenomenon that, as established in the previous episode, substantial alcohol consumption significantly increases the likelihood of through its vasodilating effects on blood vessels throughout the body, including the delicate vascular tissue lining the nasal cavity. In an ordinary waking state, or even during ordinary sleep for a sober individual, a nosebleed of this kind, while unpleasant and potentially alarming, rarely poses any genuine life-threatening risk, since the body's normal reflexive responses, waking, sitting up, tilting the head forward, swallowing or spitting to clear blood from the throat, would typically manage the situation without serious incident, however messy or uncomfortable the immediate experience might prove. Attila's specific circumstances that night, however, combined multiple factors in a sequence that medical historians studying this case have consistently identified as creating genuinely lethal risk. His significant level of intoxication would have substantially suppressed the normal reflexive responses that a sober body relies upon to protect the airway during exactly this kind of medical event: the coughing reflex, the gag reflex, and the more basic protective instinct that would ordinarily cause even a sleeping person to stir, reposition, or wake entirely in response to blood beginning to pool in the back of the throat. His specific sleeping position, flat on his back rather than on his side, meant that blood from the nosebleed, rather than draining forward and out through the nostrils where it would have been visually obvious and relatively harmless, instead flowed backward down the throat, directly toward the airway that his suppressed reflexes were no longer functioning normally to protect. The physiological process that followed, as reconstructed by both the ancient sources describing the discovery of Attila's body the following morning and by modern medical historians who have examined this case using contemporary understanding of exactly this category of medical emergency, would have unfolded gradually rather than instantaneously, a detail that carries its own particular, quiet horror when fully considered. Blood continuing to flow from the ruptured nasal blood vessels, combined with Attila's suppressed reflexive responses and his specific reclined position, would have progressively accumulated in his throat and begun obstructing his airway, a process that modern medical understanding indicates would typically unfold over a period of minutes rather than seconds, gradually restricting and eventually fully blocking his ability to breathe as blood continued accumulating faster than his severely alcohol-suppressed reflexes could manage to clear it. There would have been no dramatic final struggle of the kind that popular imagination might expect to accompany the death of a ruler whose reputation for military ruthlessness had terrorized two Roman empires for decades. The specific combination of deep intoxication and the particular physiological mechanism involved meant that Attila, according to the reconstructed sequence of events that both ancient and modern analysis broadly agree upon, likely never regained sufficient consciousness to understand what was happening to him, sliding instead from an already suppressed, alcohol-induced sleep directly into progressive asphyxiation, without ever achieving the kind of clear waking awareness that might have allowed him to call for help, reposition himself, or take any of the basic protective actions that could have prevented what was, by any objective medical assessment, an entirely preventable death arising from a genuinely mundane physiological event that countless people throughout history have experienced without fatal consequence, precisely because they were not simultaneously experiencing the specific combination of severe intoxication and unfortunate sleeping position that transformed an ordinary nosebleed into a lethal airway obstruction. Whatever Ildico herself experienced or witnessed during these hours, whether she was asleep beside her new husband and remained unaware of what was occurring until it was already too late to intervene, or whether she was awake and aware but, as some historical reconstructions have suggested, too frightened of the powerful and famously terrifying man she had just married to attempt any direct physical intervention on his behalf, remains genuinely unknown and effectively unknowable given the complete absence of any surviving first-hand account from her own perspective. What is certain, based on the physical evidence subsequently discovered and the broader historical consensus regarding the medical mechanism involved, is that at some point during those early morning hours, Attila, ruler of an empire that had brought two Roman superpowers to the negotiating table through fear alone, died silently in his own bed, asphyxiated by his own blood, with no one present who either understood what was happening in time to intervene, or possessed the capacity to do anything meaningful about it even if they had. The morning following the wedding celebration proceeded, for those outside the private nuptial chamber, according to what should have been an entirely ordinary pattern of royal court routine, at least initially. Attila's personal attendants and the senior commanders responsible for managing the practical business of court administration would have expected their ruler to emerge from his private quarters at some point during the morning hours to resume his customary duties, and, quite possibly, to continue whatever remained of the wedding celebration's associated social and political obligations toward the assembled guests and dignitaries who had travelled considerable distances to attend the occasion. As the morning hours passed without any sign of Attila emerging from his chamber, the attendants and guards stationed outside, reportedly numbering in the dozens, maintaining the kind of close, continuous security presence that a ruler of Attila's position and the correspondingly numerous enemies and rivals his decades of conquest had inevitably accumulated would have required, as a matter of basic prudent security practice, began experiencing the kind of gradually intensifying concern that comes from routine expectations going unexpectedly, inexplicably unmet. Attila's absence, extending well beyond what even the most generous allowance for a wedding night's typical activities and understandable desire for privacy would reasonably account for, eventually reached a point where his attendants judged the situation sufficiently unusual to warrant direct action. Despite whatever natural reluctance existed regarding the prospect of disturbing their ruler's private marital chamber without explicit invitation or summons. According to the surviving historical accounts, the attendants first attempted to rouse Attila through calling out and making noise near the chamber entrance, a conventional and appropriately respectful method of attracting attention without directly violating the privacy that royal custom would ordinarily have afforded to exactly this kind of situation. When this approach produced no response of any kind, no answering voice, no sound of movement, nothing beyond continued and increasingly ominous silence from within the chamber, the assembled attendants made the difficult decision to break through the chamber's door directly, a decision that itself represented a genuinely significant breach of ordinary court protocol, undertaken only because the alternative of continued waiting had become, by this point, considerably more alarming than the prospect of the consequences that might follow from disturbing their ruler without explicit permission. What the attendants discovered upon finally gaining entry to the chamber, according to the consistent core details preserved across the surviving historical accounts of this episode, presented a scene that must have been genuinely shocking, precisely because of how thoroughly it diverged from every category of death these particular observers, veterans of decades of continuous warfare, and the accumulated violence that career entailed, would have been professionally and personally accustomed to encountering. Attila lay dead in his bed, his body showing no wounds of any kind, no evidence of blade, no marks of strangulation, no indication whatsoever of the kind of violent physical assault that men in his position, and the attendants tasked with protecting him, would have naturally suspected as the most immediately plausible explanation for an unexpected royal death. Instead, the room and Attila's own face and upper body were extensively marked with blood that had, by this point, dried, the visible physical trace of the nosebleed that had, over the preceding hours, silently claimed his life through the specific mechanism the previous episode has already established in detail. Beside the bed, according to the surviving accounts, Ildico sat in a state described as genuine and evidently profound distress, weeping, and, in some versions of the account, having covered her face with a veil or cloth, whether from grief, shock, fear of how she herself might be perceived and treated in the aftermath of her new husband's sudden and mysterious death, or some combination of all three emotional responses that the surviving sources do not attempt to definitively pass or explain. Her precise emotional and psychological state during this discovery, and indeed throughout the entire preceding night, remains one of the genuine, permanently unresolved mysteries surrounding this entire episode, a gap in the historical record that later speculation, as the concluding episodes of this series will explore, would eventually attempt to fill with theories considerably more dramatic than the straightforward medical explanation the physical evidence itself actually supports. News of Attila's death, once confirmed by the attendants who had discovered his body, spread through the assembled camp and the broader gathered wedding celebration's remaining guests, with what the surviving accounts describe as extraordinary, almost instantaneous speed, producing a wave of shock and disorientation among a military and political confederation that had, for decades, organized its entire understanding of its own place in the world around the specific, seemingly permanent fact of Attila's personal leadership and military dominance. Court physicians, summoned to examine the body and determine, insofar as the medical understanding available in the 5th century permitted, the actual cause of death, reportedly confirmed what the physical evidence already strongly suggested, that Attila had died from the effects of a severe, uncontrolled nasal hemorrhage, exactly the kind of ordinary, non-violent medical event that could, in principle, befall any individual, regardless of their position, power, or military reputation, given the right, or in this specific case, catastrophically wrong, combination of circumstances. The genuine historical and psychological significance of this discovery deserves emphasis. A ruler whose military campaigns had for decades made him the single most feared individual across an enormous swath of the European continent. A man who had personally survived countless battles, and whatever undocumented assassination attempts a career of his particular nature and duration must inevitably have generated, had died not through any of the violent means that both his enemies and his own followers might have reasonably anticipated as the eventual cause of his death, but through a mundane, almost embarrassingly ordinary physiological accident occurring in the private, unwitnessed quiet of his own bedchamber, on what should have been among the happiest and most celebratory nights of his entire life. The immediate practical consequences of this discovery within the camp itself unfolded with a speed that reflects just how thoroughly the entire Hunnic Confederation's political and military machinery depended on Attila's continuous, personal presence at its center. Messengers were reportedly dispatched within hours to inform the various subordinate commanders, subject kings, and allied leaders who had not been present at the immediate scene, carrying news that would, within days, begin reaching every corner of a confederation stretching across a significant portion of the European continent. For many of the assembled dignitaries and diplomatic representatives who had travelled considerable distances specifically to attend what they had understood to be a celebratory wedding, the abrupt transformation of that same gathering into the sight of their host's sudden death produced a genuinely disorienting shift in the practical business each of them now needed to attend to: questions of succession, continued loyalty, and the future shape of a confederation whose entire structure had, until that morning, seemed built to last indefinitely under its founding ruler's continued personal command. The Hunnic response to Attila's sudden and entirely unanticipated death reflected mourning customs that, as preserved in the historical account of the 6th century Gothic historian Jordanes, diverged sharply from the funerary practices familiar to Roman and broader Mediterranean cultural tradition, offering modern readers a genuinely striking window into steppe nomadic conceptions of appropriate grief, masculine honor, and the proper commemoration of a warrior ruler's death. Jordanes' account, itself drawing on the earlier historical work of Priscus and other now lost sources closer to the actual events, records that Hunnic custom regarded conventional weeping, the shedding of tears in mourning, the kind of emotional display that Roman and broader Mediterranean funerary tradition generally regarded as an entirely appropriate and even expected response to significant loss, as an inadequate and insufficiently dignified form of mourning for a warrior of Attila's stature and accomplishment. Tears, within this specific cultural framework as Jordanes describes it, were understood as an appropriately feminine mode of grief, suitable for the ordinary losses of ordinary life, but genuinely inadequate to properly honor the death of a supreme warrior king whose life and legacy demanded a correspondingly more dramatic, more explicitly masculine form of commemorative mourning. The specific mourning ritual that Hunnic warriors instead performed according to Jourdaines's detailed account, involved warriors cutting their own hair short as an initial visible sign of grief and loss, a practice with parallels across numerous other ancient and steppe nomadic cultures in which the deliberate alteration or sacrifice of personal appearance served as a recognized, visible marker of mourning status. Beyond this haircutting, however, the Hunnic warriors performed something considerably more physically dramatic and, to modern sensibilities, genuinely startling. They drew their own weapons and deliberately cut their own faces, opening self-inflicted wounds specifically intended to draw visible blood as an expression of grief calibrated to the magnitude of what had been lost. Jourdaines explicitly frames the underlying cultural logic behind this specific practice in terms that deserve direct quotation for how clearly they articulate the value system driving it, that the greatest of warriors should be mourned not with a woman's tears, but with a man's blood, a formulation that positions this specific mourning ritual as a direct. This ritual bloodletting, performed by warriors who had themselves fought under Attila's direct command across numerous campaigns, and who had, in many cases, built their own personal status, wealth, and position substantially on the foundation of his decades of successful military leadership, represented a form of collective mourning that fused genuine, evidently sincere personal and communal grief with the specific martial value system that had defined Hunnic warrior culture throughout Attila's reign, and, in all likelihood, for generations preceding it as well. Following this initial phase of ritual mourning, Attila's body was prepared for the elaborate funerary observances that his position and accomplishments demanded, beginning with the placement of his body in state within an elaborately decorated silk tent or pavilion, a setting that allowed the assembled Hunnic military and political leadership, along with whatever representatives of subject and allied peoples remained present, following the wedding celebration's abrupt and tragic transformation into a funeral, to formally pay their respects to their fallen ruler in a manner appropriate to his status. The most visually and symbolically striking element of this funerary observance, according to the surviving historical descriptions, involved a ceremonial procession in which the finest and most accomplished Hunnic cavalrymen, mounted on their horses, rode in formation around the pavilion containing Attila's body, performing what amounted to a mounted funeral dirge, chanting or singing songs that recounted and celebrated Attila's military victories, his conquests, and the specific achievements that had made him, during his lifetime, the single most feared ruler across an enormous swath of the European continent. This combination of solemn commemoration and explicit celebration of martial achievement, performed by horsemen circling the body of their fallen leader in a display that must have been genuinely striking to witness, captures something essential about how Hunnic culture understood the proper relationship between mourning and honor. Grief for Attila's death and celebration of Attila's life were not treated as separate or competing modes of response to be balanced against one another, but as complementary, mutually reinforcing elements of a single unified funerary tradition specifically calibrated to honor a warrior ruler whose life had been defined, from beginning to end, by conquest and martial accomplishment. Following the completion of the ritual mourning and the mounted funerary procession described in the previous episode, Attila's followers proceeded to prepare his body for permanent burial through an elaborate, multi-layered funerary construction specifically designed to reflect the full scope of his accumulated wealth, power, and military accomplishment across his decades of successful rule. Jourdaines's historical account describes a triple coffin arrangement of genuinely striking symbolic and material sophistication, constructed specifically to honor Attila's memory through a deliberate progression of materials, each layer carrying its own distinct symbolic significance within the broader commemorative structure. The innermost coffin, positioned in direct contact with Attila's body itself, was constructed from pure gold, a material choice explicitly intended to represent and commemorate the vast wealth that decades of successful conquest, and particularly the substantial tribute payments extracted from the Eastern Roman Empire, had brought into Hunnic possession throughout his reign. This innermost golden coffin was then enclosed within a second, surrounding coffin constructed from silver, a material selected specifically for its symbolic association with light, radiance, and the broader visible splendor that Attila's power and authority had projected throughout his reign. Finally, this combined double coffin was enclosed within a third and outermost layer constructed from iron, a deliberate and evidently carefully considered symbolic choice representing the harder, more martial dimensions of Attila's legacy. The military strength, the weapons of conquest, and the sheer, uncompromising ruthlessness that had characterized his approach to warfare and had made his campaigns so consistently, devastatingly effective across multiple decades of continuous military activity against numerous different opponents. This carefully constructed, symbolically layered triple coffin, containing both Attila's body and an evidently substantial additional quantity of treasure and grave goods appropriate to his position, was then transported, according to Jordanes' account, to a secret burial location under cover of darkness, accompanied only by a small, specifically trusted group of Attila's most loyal followers, in a deliberate effort to ensure that the exact location of his final resting place would remain permanently secret and protected from any future attempt at discovery, disturbance, or plunder by enemies, rivals, or simple opportunistic grave robbers who might otherwise be drawn by the substantial wealth known to have been interred alongside the body. The specific method by which this concealment was reportedly achieved carries its own genuinely remarkable engineering and logistical ambition, whatever degree of literal historical accuracy the surviving account actually reflects. According to the tradition Jordanes preserves, Attila's followers temporarily diverted the flow of a river, damming or otherwise redirecting its natural course specifically to expose the riverbed beneath, dug the burial site directly into the now exposed riverbed itself, interred the triple coffin and its accompanying treasure at this location, and then released the diverted water to resume its natural course, permanently covering and concealing the burial site beneath the flowing river itself, a location that would render any subsequent excavation attempt extraordinarily difficult, even for searchers who possessed reasonably accurate knowledge of the burial's general location, let alone for later searchers operating with no reliable knowledge whatsoever regarding where along the relevant river system the actual burial site might be found. To ensure that this carefully engineered secrecy would remain permanently secure against any future betrayal, whether through deliberate disclosure or simple accidental revelation, the historical tradition preserves an additional and genuinely disturbing detail. The laborers and workers who had actually performed the physical labor of diverting the river, digging the burial site, and subsequently restoring the river's natural flow were reportedly killed immediately following the completion of their task by the same small group of trusted followers who had organized and overseen the entire burial process, eliminating every individual who possessed direct first-hand knowledge of the burial site's specific location, and thereby ensuring that this knowledge would die along with them, rather than risk any future disclosure, whether voluntary or coerced, that might lead outside parties to the location of Attila's remains and the substantial treasure interred alongside them. This combination of deliberate engineering concealment and the systematic elimination of anyone possessing direct knowledge of the burial site's location has proven, across the 15 intervening centuries since Attila's death, to be genuinely and completely effective, despite extensive historical interest, periodic archaeological investigation, and numerous specific search efforts conducted across the broader Hungarian and Central European region, where historians generally believe the burial most likely occurred. No confirmed archaeological discovery of Attila's actual burial site has ever been made, and the location remains, to this day, one of the most significant and enduring unsolved mysteries in the entire field of European archaeology. Various search efforts across the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries have pursued numerous different specific theories regarding the burial's likely location, and the search has, across this extended period, cost significant financial resources and, in some documented instances, resulted in the deaths of searchers pursuing this elusive and historically resonant archaeological prize, a fitting if genuinely somber continuation of the deliberate secrecy Attila's original followers worked so systematically and so ruthlessly to establish in the immediate aftermath of his death. The genuinely striking historical irony of Attila's death, a ruler whose military campaigns had terrorized two Roman empires and whose personal survival through decades of continuous warfare had seemed, to contemporaries, almost supernaturally assured, dying instead through an ordinary, non-violent physiological accident on what should have been among the most celebratory nights of his entire life, has, unsurprisingly, generated centuries of historical speculation and alternative theorizing, extending well beyond the straightforward medical explanation that the earliest and most historically reliable surviving sources actually describe. The most persistent and historically durable alternative theory involves Ildico herself, Attila's new bride, whose presence in the chamber during the hours preceding his death and whose documented emotional distress upon the discovery of his body have made her, for many later historians and popular commentators alike, an inevitable object of suspicion regarding a death that seemed, to many observers across the centuries since, simply too convenient in its timing and circumstances to accept entirely at face value. Various versions of this assassination theory have proposed that Ildico either administered some form of poison to Attila during the wedding celebration or its immediate aftermath, or that she took more direct physical action once he had fallen into his deep, alcohol-induced sleep, smothering him, in some versions of this theory, using bedding or some other readily available means, exploiting his profound intoxication to ensure he would offer no meaningful resistance to a direct physical attack. The specific motive most commonly attributed to Ildico within these various assassination theories involves personal or familial vengeance, since historians generally believe she was of Ostrogothic or broader Germanic origin, drawn from peoples who existed as subject populations within Attila's broader confederation, and who had, in many documented instances across the preceding decades, suffered military conquest, territorial loss, and various other forms of violence and subjugation at Hunnic hands. The theory proposes that Ildico may have harbored genuine personal or family-based motivation for wishing Attila dead. Motivation that a wedding night providing unusually direct, private, and unguarded access to his person would have offered a uniquely favorable opportunity to act upon. A second major alternative theory, considerably more geopolitically oriented in its underlying logic, proposes that the Eastern Roman Emperor Marcian, whose recent politically risky refusal to continue the substantial tribute payments Attila's predecessors in Constantinople had reluctantly maintained, had directly provoked Attila's renewed military preparations against the Eastern Empire in the months immediately preceding his death, may have arranged for a secret assassin or assassins to be positioned within Attila's court, specifically to eliminate the Hunnic ruler before his planned renewed campaign against Constantinople could actually be launched, using either Ildico herself as an unwitting or knowing instrument, or some other undisclosed agent, operating within the wedding celebration's substantial assembled crowd of guests and attendants. Both of these assassination theories, whatever their genuine dramatic and narrative appeal, face a consistent and, in the judgment of the substantial majority of modern historians who have carefully examined this question, decisive practical obstacle: They require dismissing or substantially reinterpreting the earliest and most historically reliable surviving accounts of Attila's death. Sources including Priscus's own near-contemporary historical writing, along with Jourdaines's later but still relatively proximate account, both of which consistently and specifically describe death through natural, non-violent means. The severe nasal hemorrhage and subsequent asphyxiation described in detail across the preceding episodes of this series, without any suggestion of external violence, foul play, or deliberate human intervention of any kind. Modern medical historians who have specifically examined this case, using contemporary understanding of exactly this category of medical emergency, have generally found the natural death explanation preserved in these earliest surviving sources to be entirely medically plausible, and in fact, to align closely with well-documented, if genuinely rare, real-world cases of exactly this kind of fatal outcome, resulting from the specific combination of severe intoxication, a supine sleeping position, and a spontaneous nasal or related hemorrhage, a category of death that medical literature has continued to document in occasional individual cases extending into the modern era, confirming that the specific physiological mechanism the ancient sources describe represents a genuine, medically well-understood cause of death, rather than merely a convenient or implausible cover story invented to obscure some other, more dramatic underlying cause. Some medical historians examining this specific case have additionally proposed that Attila may have suffered from a pre-existing condition, such as esophageal varices, abnormally enlarged and fragile blood vessels within the esophagus, a condition frequently associated with chronic liver disease and, notably, with sustained heavy alcohol consumption over an extended period. That would have made him particularly vulnerable to exactly this kind of severe, sudden hemorrhage under the specific circumstances of his uncharacteristically heavy wedding night drinking, offering a more medically detailed refinement of the basic nosebleed and asphyxiation mechanism the ancient sources describe, without in any way contradicting or displacing the fundamental natural causes explanation those earliest sources consistently present. The broader historiographical lesson this specific case illustrates, regarding how historical memory processes deaths that combine genuine dramatic irony with insufficient surviving eyewitness detail to fully and definitively close off alternative interpretation, extends well beyond the specific question of what actually happened to Attila on that particular night in 453 AD. Sudden, unexpected deaths of powerful and consequential historical figures have, across virtually every documented period and culture throughout human history, consistently generated exactly this kind of persistent alternative theorizing and suspicion of foul play, regardless of how medically plausible and well-supported the natural causes explanation preserved in the most historically reliable available sources actually proves to be upon careful examination. A pattern of historical memory that says at least as much about human psychology's persistent discomfort with genuinely mundane, anticlimactic explanations for historically significant events as it does about the specific, particular circumstances of any individual case under examination. Whatever the precise, ultimately unknowable truth regarding the exact circumstances of Attila's death, natural physiological accident, as the earliest and most historically reliable surviving sources consistently describe, or some form of deliberate human intervention, as later speculation and alternative theorizing has repeatedly proposed without ever managing to displace the natural causes explanation from its position as the historically dominant and best evidenced account. The practical, historically documented consequences of his sudden and entirely unanticipated death proved swift, dramatic, and genuinely transformative for the broader political landscape of 5th century Europe. The Hunnic Empire that Attila had spent decades constructing and holding together through a combination of military conquest, calculated political alliance building, and the sheer, personally embodied force of his own accumulated reputation and authority, proved, in the immediate aftermath of his death, to be an entity whose cohesion had depended overwhelmingly on his specific personal leadership, rather than on any deeper, more durable institutional or administrative foundation capable of surviving his removal from the political equation. Attila's numerous sons, several of whom had been positioned by their father across various portions of his vast confederated territory in anticipation of eventually sharing in the succession, immediately began contesting the specific division of authority and territory among themselves, a succession dispute that rapidly escalated from political maneuvering into open, sustained military conflict between rival claimants and their respective factions of supporters. This internal succession conflict, combined with the simultaneous opportunity that Attila's death and the resulting Hunnic internal disunity presented to the numerous subject and formerly subject peoples who had, across the preceding decades, chafed under Hunnic domination while lacking any realistic prospect of successful resistance, while Attila himself remained alive and in unchallenged command of the Confederation's combined military resources, produced a rapid and genuinely dramatic unraveling of the entire Hunnic imperial structure. Various subject peoples, most notably including Germanic groups such as the Gepids under their king Ardaric, rose in open revolt against continued Hunnic authority, and the decisive battle that followed, fought at the Nadaio River in 454 AD, within a single year of Attila's death, resulted in a comprehensive military defeat for the Hunnic forces and their remaining loyalist allies, a defeat from which the broader Hunnic Imperial Confederation never meaningfully recovered. Within approximately 16 years of Attila's death, the vast, ethnically diverse and militarily formidable empire that had, at its height under his personal leadership, extracted regular tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire and had brought the Western Roman Empire to the brink of direct military catastrophe on multiple occasions, had effectively ceased to exist as any kind of coherent, unified political or military entity, its various constituent peoples and territories fragmenting into smaller, independent successor groups that pursued their own separate political trajectories across the following decades and centuries, none of them ever again approaching the scale of unified military and political power that Attila's personal leadership had, for a relatively brief but historically consequential period, managed to concentrate and direct. This remarkably rapid collapse, an empire that had seemed, to contemporary observers throughout Attila's own lifetime, to represent a permanent and existentially threatening fixture of the European political landscape, dissolving into fragmented irrelevance within less than 2 decades of its founding ruler's death, offers a genuinely instructive historical illustration of a broader pattern that recurs throughout the history of personally centralized, charismatically led political and military confederations across numerous different historical periods and cultural contexts. Political structures built primarily around the personal authority, military reputation, and individually embodied leadership capability of a single dominant ruler frequently prove, once that ruler is removed from the equation through death or incapacity, to lack the deeper institutional foundations, established succession mechanisms, and broader administrative infrastructure necessary to survive the transition to new leadership, with anything approaching their previous scale of cohesion, authority, and effective operational capability. The specific manner of Attila's death, considered within this broader context of the empire's rapid subsequent collapse, adds a particular and genuinely striking layer of historical irony to the entire episode this series has documented across its preceding 9 installments. A ruler whose decades of military conquest had been built on inflicting violent, deliberate death upon countless thousands of opponents across numerous campaigns spanning the length and breadth of the European continent, and whose personal survival through this same extended period of continuous violence had seemed, to contemporaries on every side of his numerous conflicts, almost supernaturally assured given the sheer number of battles, campaigns, and presumably undocumented assassination attempts he had successfully survived across his lifetime, ultimately died not through any of the violent means his own life's work had made so intimately and repeatedly familiar to him, but through an entirely mundane, non-violent physiological accident, a severe nosebleed combined with an unfortunate sleeping position and a genuinely uncharacteristic single night of excessive drinking that could, in principle, have claimed the life of any ordinary individual across any period of human history, entirely independent of military reputation, political power, or accumulated conquest. The Scourge of God, the man whose approach had caused 2 Roman empires to empty their treasuries in desperate tribute payments, and whose armies had reduced entire cities to rubble so complete that later generations struggled to locate where they had once stood, died alone in the dark, in his own bed, on the happiest night of his life, killed by nothing more dramatic than his own blood and his own body's failure to protect itself during a moment of uncharacteristic vulnerability. A conclusion that no enemy soldier, no rival king, and no assassin, real or merely rumored, ever actually managed to achieve across his entire, otherwise remarkably violent and historically consequential life. There is a final, quieter lesson embedded in this story that extends beyond the specific fate of one 5th-century conqueror. Every institution Attila built, every treasury he filled through tribute, every subject people he compelled into submission, depended entirely on the continued, physical presence of a single human body doing what human bodies eventually cannot avoid: aging, drinking too much on one uncharacteristic night, falling asleep in the wrong position, and failing in some small, unglamorous way that had nothing to do with strategy, courage, or conquest. The empire that seemed, to every contemporary observer, permanent and unshakable, turned out to be exactly as fragile as the throat of the man who built it. 16 years is not a long time for history to erase something that had once made 2 empires kneel. It is, in fact, barely longer than the span of a single human generation, a sobering reminder that even the most fearsome accumulations of power in human history often rest on foundations no more permanent than a single person's continued ability to keep breathing through the night.